What's up, everybody? In today's video, we are going to talk about event property default data specifically for Power Apps components. So we're going to see how that default data can be fallback data, but you can also use it for testing, and you can use it as a strict contract between your app and your component to ensure the data is always accurate, consistent, and scalable. Let's check them out.
All right, just a little bit about me. Again, my name is David Warner. I run a blog and YouTube site, warner.digital, work for Quisitive. I'm an MVP, I'm an MCT, but most importantly, I am the biggest fan of all of you in the community. I love working with you, love working on programs like the Recognition Program and Sharing is Caring. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. Don't be shy. Let's collaborate together. Let's get more involved in some community conversations and collaborations, and look forward to working with each and every one of you. All right, so what is on our agenda for this particular video? We are going to begin by talking about default values, overview, and documentation, and specifically to events. So we'll cover the overview of just default values as well as events. If you've not seen any of the other videos, you'll be set. And then we're going to get into a demo specifically around using default values with event properties. First things first, the documentation here on the left. What you see here on the left, this is literally the entire documentation for default values. So it's a little light, and that's okay. It's an opportunity for us to kind of explore and discover what's capable. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can pause it if you'd like and read it, but pretty basic information it provides. So if we move over to the right and look at the key benefits, what are some of the things that we want to look out for if this was translated into benefits? Well, it's required and optional contracts between the component and the app. And what does that mean, required and optional? We'll talk about that. Don't worry. It's depending on the type of property you're using. It provides fallback values when no input is given. So if you're not making it a required value on your property or parameter, then you could have a fallback. But it also ensures consistent behavior across your component instances, can help establish clear data schema. So for example, if you're using records and you've got very specific data in your record that you need, it provides that clarity, which is super valuable. And then it simplifies user interactions by, again, setting that expectation of values up front. Now, one thing to think about is when you're passing values and you've got default values already in place, for example, within your component, you can fall back to those. So if no value is provided, you can fall back to them. But if you do provide anything, like for example, if you've got a record that's got 5 different key value pairs in them and you only provide 2, it's not going to fall back to the 3 you didn't, right? So it's kind of an all or nothing package. So think about that. And then it must obviously comply with the data type or the return data type of the property. So if you set up your property to be of type record, which we'll see in this demo, then it's going to expect a record. You try to pass it just plain text or an image or something like that, it's going to give you some grief and tell you, no, sorry, I'm waiting for something else, and it's a record. So again, those are hard and fast requirements, which are actually very, very good, right? Make sure that your component is getting the data it's expecting. Now, when we look at event property default values, what's the key benefits and factors to consider? These have a required and strict contract between the component and the app. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you watched the other video on just data properties, input output, then you know that those were a kind of sort of maybe loose contract. It was, you could include some data, but you weren't required to include all of it. For example, in the case of a record, if you had a key value pair or multiple key value pairs, you could just provide some of them. But in the case of event properties, it is required and strict. Now, it's most useful when coupled with property parameters or return data. And so we'll see examples of both those scenarios. Now, the key factors to consider is that default values can be referenced in return data if in a return data type is used, which is pretty cool. We'll see that. We'll see both return data types of none and record. And then function properties of type input use default values in the same way. So event properties and function properties of type input are kind of like siblings or cousins. They are closely tied together. An event is technically an input property. A function input property is obviously an input property. And those are identical, with the exception that the event properties are more robust. They have expression chaining, and you can do selects and resets and all that kind of jazz, right? So they function the same way. So you won't see a video done specifically on function properties, because they work pretty much the same as events and actions. Actions are output. All right, so let's take a look at what is on our agenda for our demo today. So we're going to stick with the badge information. We're going to start by creating an event property with a defined data type of type record. And then we're going to create a parameter with defined data types of type record. So we're going to kind of see that creating the default data specific to the property itself may not work for us, but where it really shines is in the case of the parameter. And then we're going to enforce the default data requirements when we execute that event property inside of the component. Because remember, an event property starts its journey, if you will, inside of the component, then lets the app know that, hey, this happened, go do what you want to do. And then we're going to identify how to use default data when we're using a return data type. So we'll use no data type, and then we'll see a return data type of type record and see how we can kind of use everything under the sun in relation to event properties and default data. So let's get in there and take a look. Alrighty, so we are in Power Apps. I've set up a component library like I have many of my other scenarios. And what it is, just for some context, is I've set up a component here. Keep wanting to say comp component for event properties default values. Then I've also set up a screen. I've added the component here, just kind of renamed it. And that's fine. We'll back up here. And that's fine, right? So renamed it so it's easier to reference, all good to go. So first thing we want to do is we want to go set up an event property. So I'm going to do that. I'm just going to simply call it event property or event record property. And description's fine. Data type, we're going to change that to event, and then return type we'll leave for none right now. And then parameters, we're not going to use them right quite yet. We're going to take this step by step. So I'm going to hit create. And then I'm going to come over to that property value, and you can do that by clicking on it. It will take us up into the formula bar, and I'm going to add that desired default value in here, right? So I've got badge name, Fork Awakens, badge URL. This is a link to an image in Credly, and total badges earned, just to kind of show a number. Right? Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to move over to the app, and we want to see how we can access these values. Oh, and I did just want to remind you a little bit about how the event properties work, right? Now I created a whole nother video that goes way more in depth on exactly how these work, so I'm not going to go too deep, but just as a reminder, what happens is you invoke the event function in the component. Then when that happens, it lets the app know that, hey, something's happened in the component. You can do something now based on being alerted that that happened. So when we go over to the app, we're going to see how that works, right? Because we're able to access it as a property of the component. So if I go back over to my screen, I've already, like I said, got the component added onto the page. That's all good to go. And I'm going to keep having to scroll out, and I'll go over to that, and I will go over to that event record property, right? So it's right there. Cool, cool. So I click on that and I see my information. Now, again, the concept is that, okay, the event happened inside the component. I fired off the function for that event inside the component. And now this is where we would define what functionality happens, what functionality happens when that event happens, right? So it could be a button click inside the component. It could be really anything we want. Something happens. It could be a dropdown changed. Something else happens. Some processing finished. Essentially, we're going to execute that function in the component, and it's going to let our app know. Then our app's going to do something with it. So what we've done is we've got a value here, right? And I could try to use these. I'm not quite sure how I would do that, right? It's defining default properties. This is the default value. How do I access this information? I'm really not quite sure. Is this really how these default values should work in an event? Well, probably not. The documentation references that default values are not necessarily applicable in every scenario, but where we really see them shine is in parameters. So talked about it is same thing is applicable to action and function output. Those are coupled together. And then in this case, function input and events are coupled together. So parameters are really where that shines and where you can kind of utilize those default values to set either as a fallback or as the expected data to be transferred in via the parameter. So let's go back over to our component and take a look. We'll go over to our component and we'll go into our record property, and we will add a parameter. So we do that by going to the properties, clean new parameter. Let me close that so we can see. All right, so parameter name, let's give it param event record. And then let's give a description here. I'll explain why in a moment. You may already know if you've seen my action action video on this. So we'll change this to record, and we'll leave it at required as yes for now. Okay, so we'll click create, Save. Yep, we're going to do that. We can access that parameter by going to the properties dropdown of our component. And it's always kind of indented or tabbed below the actual property name because they're kind of coupled and tied together, right? So I'm going to go to that param, and it just input this sample data, right? It always does that. Whatever data type you select, it'll input a sample of that. It's always kind of sample string field, number field, Boolean field, etc. But we want to replace that with some of the data we've been using around our may the fourth be with you, right? So we've got our badge name, Fork Awakens, a URL to the image, and total badges earned. Okay, cool. So now we want to invoke this on the component side, right? So the way that we will take advantage of executing this function, remember, for an event, is you do that on the actual component side. So I'm going to close that up. I'm going to come insert a button. So it's a big button. Wow, that is moving around. All right, so let's set that button here, and we'll call it event button. All right, and in our onSelect now, we can come in and we can call our actual event property, right? So that's our component. And then we do the dot notation, and there is our event property. Okay, cool. So we'll call that dot event record property. And then it's a function. So you open param. And so now this is why I said, hey, include that little description, because you wouldn't otherwise know. You could be more verbose here if you wanted to, but you wouldn't otherwise know that it's expecting a record. Now the name of it is kind of indicative of that, but your name could be anything you want, right? I could have just said, hey, parameter 1, and that's not very self-explanatory at all. I could have been wowee for Chris Kent, whatever. Point is that it's helping them understand. And in this case, when you're using a record, when they see that a record is expected, that's okay, great. That means that probably the first character I should type is a curly brace. And so when I do that, this is where even more awesomeness happens, because now it's showing what the expected schema is for that exact parameter, right? So I can now add in some information here if I want, right? So I'm going to take the same schema that I had before and just paste it in. It's a little easier. Paste that in and put a close param. I'm going to hit format text, and it's going to show me exactly what that looks like, right? So a little cleaner. So now what happens is when I click this button inside of my component, then it's going to fire off an alert to my app that, hey, this event was fired, and it's going to pass this data over to my app to use, right? Okay, and we've defined that needs to look like that, right? And so that is great. So let's go back to our app and see how we would take advantage of this. And so we'll do that. We'll go back to our app or representation of the app here on the screen. We see the event button has been added and we're selected on the comp. And when we come in, here's our record property, right? So this is what's going to function or execute, or where we're going to define the function that we want to have happen when that event fires. Now, what we can do is we can do event dot, and okay, so we don't really see our actual property name there, right? Now we execute it on the component side, so it makes sense that we wouldn't see it here. So then how do we get access to those values? We do that through the parameter itself. So if I tap param, I can access the component parameter value by doing this. And this is the only place we could do it, right? If within the app somewhere else I tried to reference this particular property or parameter property, it's not going to have access. It's not going to let me have access. So what we want to do then is we can set up a variable, right? And I'll just kind of call it image event badge, and then I'll do param. And now this gives me access to all of that information, right? So I could choose one of these on this if I wanted to, right? I could absolutely do that. Or I could just have the record. I could go like that, do the record. And now that image event badge variable will be essentially the record, right? And I can reference it. So to make sure of that, let's do this. Let's insert an image, right? So we will say image. I'll move it down here below the component. And inside of here, I will say image event badge, right? And now normally if I had just associated the URL of the image to that variable itself, this would work in and of itself, right? But it sees that it's a record. It sees that it's a record. So obviously I need to terminate down to the actual badge URL. So when I do that, see text, bam, that is showing up now, right? Which is pretty cool. Okay, so what if I were to change that value, right? So if we go back into the component and I come into the property parameter of that, or the execution of that, I should say, here, the default we know is using that fork awakens, but let me change it to rise of the contributor. So I'm going to change it to that URL right there. And we'll say rise of the contributor. Okay, so now what's happening is my button is overwriting the default values. It is passing in the image of the rise of the contributor. I'm passing in the text. We'll leave the number the same. That's fine. We'll come back to our screen and I will scroll out a little bit here. Okay, now when I click this button, effectively what should happen is I am defining the functionality. I'm grabbing it here, right? I should say inside of that particular property, right? So I'm getting the information from that parameter. When I click it, bam, changes to rise of the contributor, right? So just again, what exactly is happening? I'm defining the functionality. In this case, I'm not really doing much. I'm just taking the parameter values and creating a variable. Ideally, what you would do is something more complex. You might be taking data from the component, updating a database in Dataverse or SharePoint or some other data structure. You might be changing stuff in your app that you want to display based on what happened in the component. Again, I'm keeping it very simple here. I'm just updating a variable with value that was passed back from the component, and then I'm displaying that within the image control here directly within the app. Now, because I had associated the entire record to that variable, I could do more here, right? Do I say right a lot? I feel like the guy in Groundhog Day. Right. Bing. All right, saying it way too much. I say it all the time. That's how you know AI has taken over me, by the way, is if I stop saying right every other word. So you can absolutely do more. Because I associated the record to the variable, I can use it in other ways. The nice thing about the event property is it allows expression chaining. So if I come back to my component, remember I'm still in the app, come back to my component where I associate that, I'm using that and the record property for the image actually in the image control here in the app. But I could also come in here and I could say, okay, notify and image event badge dot badge name, right? So now I'm able to use that in a couple of ways. I'm using it to populate an image. I'm going to use it to populate a notification. So when I click on this again, remember, I'm clicking the component. The button is inside the component. I'm in the app right now. I've got the component on my screen. I'm going to click the button, which lives in the component. It's going to fire off the event function inside the component, which then lets my app know, hey, something happened, and here's a collection of parameters for you to use, right? And I'm taking those parameters right here, associating them to that variable, and then I'm using that variable on the image control as well as notification. So if all goes well, I click this, it should say rise of the contributor. Yay! Okay, cool, right? Now, what we've really not done is utilize the default values themselves. We've used them to indicate what the schema should be. And in the case of the event, the schema is being enforced on the event side, right? So what if we were to change that to not required or something like that? So there's a few things that we want to take a look at. So I'm going to go back to the component and I'm going to go back to my event property here, or actually more specifically, let's see, the parameter name. All right, so let me do that. And we'll look at this parameter name. Now I've got the badge name, the badge URL, and the total badges earned. Now, when I execute this, by the way, it is important to note that this is a hard contract. It means that it is a strict contract. In data components, where you have just input and output. If you haven't watched that video, I recommend you watch it, but they allow some form of data, right? So if you have a default value that requires all three of these, it's not enforcing it entirely. I call it a kind of sort of maybe contract. In events and actions, as well as functions, if you've set up a data schema like this that you are absolutely expecting, you have to include that. If I were to come in here and just take out badge name, well, it errors, and when I do look at the error, it says, hey, it's kind of like you get a, hey, you're the number one loser. You did it kind of right, but not exactly. You got the fact that it's supposed to be a record, but didn't quite get the full schema. But that's also where the helper from the IntelliSense comes in, right? So you need to be aware of that. if I were to just kind of get rid of the entire record, right? And so let's say if I tried to pass in a string here, it says, hey, invalid type. Text. It sees its text, expecting a record value instead, right? So it is absolutely a strict contract between your parameter when you set default values and when you're going to pass those in. And in this case, we've set up our parameter to be required. So we absolutely have to pass it. But if I were to come over to my parameter, let's go in here and let's go into the parameter, and we're going to turn required off, right? So far, our default value has really just defined the schema that has to be passed for a record. So I'm going to turn required off. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to hit save, and it's going to tell me, hey, you're changing things. Are you sure? Now, bear in mind, I'll show you a little later that if you do this and you already have values there and you're changing the record type or the return type, it will erase what you have there. So you want to be careful. In this case, I'm going to be fine. It's not going to erase anything. We see that that stays there, and that's fine. So now what's happening is I've set my parameter requirement to none, right? It's no longer required. So if I come down to this button and I come in and remove that schema, even though the schema is expected, right? Do that and that. So I'm not passing anything. So what should theoretically happen then is now the actual values of the default data is going to get passed back to my app. So I'm still executing the actual property, right? I'm just not defining what that parameter should include. Well, the parameter does have specific, right? If I click on this and go to the parameter, there are values there. It does have default values. So then theoretically, this default value was the fork awakens. So if I come back to my app and I scroll out here and I click this button, now we see the fork awakens, even though in my component, I didn't define any values. It still fell back to the actual default values. So you can see how default values can help enforce data structure, data content, etc. In the case of a record specifically, you're defining the exact schema. But in this case, I'm actually able to provide nothing because I set the requirement to 0, or the required to 0, or to not on for the parameter. It's not required. So if I don't pass anything in, then it still works. It falls back to that default data. So you got kind of a dual benefit of using default data. Now, it's also worth noting that I could have set up separate properties for each one of these values, right? The title, the image, the count, all those could have been separate properties, required, non-required, whatever. But in this case, I think it provides a little bit more scalability and a little bit more dynamic ways in which you can build your component. I was able to define the schema. I was able to define exactly whether it's required, not required. And then I don't have to worry about having multiple properties. I just have one, and I've defined exactly what I need. I've also created a fallback. And oh, by the way, having those default values in your component allow you to do better testing of your component, because now you can reference those values within your component. I can actually reference the values that I'm expecting to come in from the parameter in the component and return types, or whatever the case may be, whether you're using action or function or event or whatever, right? So super powerful. Now, what we haven't talked about is return types. We had set up our return type in our component. If I go back over here and look at our event record property, the component or return data type is none. Now, what if we were to change this to a record? How could we utilize default values here? Well, first things first, I want to make sure you realize that if you do ever change your record type here, whether it be on the parameter or it be on the actual property, it is going to replace that actual value, right? So if I come up here to the record property, this is what I've included. And if I go back to the app and I look at that record property, that's what I've included. Now, it's important to know that in the case of the event, it's going to replace this, right? So you want to kind of come over, I'm going to copy that out and I'll show it to you. I'll go back to the component. So if you're doing any testing and you want to make sure you're preserving some of that data that you're testing with on the app side or the screen side, you want to maybe preserve it, copy it out. When I come back over here and I change this return type to record, I'm going to hit save and it's going to say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? It may cause errors because things depend on it. Yeah, it's because it's going to replace it. So right now I've got my custom schema here, right? The badge names, right, man, there I am again, right? Badge URL, etc. Hit OK. It replaces it with just the default stuff, right? So that's fine. I am going to go back over to my screen and you see that also has been done here. So, and of course there's errors happening because that's what's expecting. So I'm going to put that in. Still kind of erroring because it's expecting a record value, right? And it's expecting that record value because that's the return type. Now, in the case of event, remember it all starts inside the component. Something happens in the component, fires off the event, lets the app know the event has happened. It's the app's job then to perform functionality. In this case, it's taking in parameter values because we've included them. But then because we've turned on the return type from none to record, it's expecting us to return back to the component a record. And this is where that would happen. We would define what is being returned back to the component here. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to change that. We're going to pass in a record, right? So we're still doing our functionality here. And I am going to return type that. There we go. And of course, what's happening now is it's saying the record passed has none of the expected fields. So instead of telling us, hey, you tried and you got some right, in this case, it tells us you got absolutely nothing right. And why is that? Well, it's because if we go back to the component, and we go back into, not on the button, but on the actual component, and we go into the property, right? When we set up and change that property type record, it changed this over to that sample value. It had replaced it. So if I just paste the same thing in here, fork awakens, there's the URL, and I go back now to my screen, and I click on the component, and I look at the, let's see, the screen component, there we go. Oh yeah, when I pasted it in, it removed the other stuff too, right? So again, that you start getting kind of caught. So I want to do if I do this set, what was the name of that? This is a good example of why you want to be careful, right? And be aware and preserve all of your stuff. So I come back in here. This is all real coding, everybody. Do that, and then the value is the param, right? So I'll do that. And then I think I did notify, and then I did image and dot batch name, right? Okay, because remember, event allows expression chaining. So now what's happening is I'm passing, it's executing in the component, right? When I click this event button, it's passing the default parameter because I didn't set anything, remember? So it's just falling back to the default values back, and it's passing it in. I'm getting that badge name, and then I'm taking kind of the same data here, right? And passing it back in. So if I click this, we see the fork awakens. Now, ideally, what we want to do though, is we want to pass something else. So I'm going to say, just to show that this is all working, rise of the contributor, right? And I'm going to go get that value here, rise of the contributor. Where's that URL? There we go. I'm going to grab that URL and I'm going to pass it here, right? Okay, let me do that. Okay, cool. Ooh, that's ugly. Let's get rid of that. Get rid of that. That's fine. Okay, cool. So no errors, right? And so what's happening is the event button gets clicked. It is absorbing or obtaining on the app side the information from the component. Again, there's a lot of moving parts here, everybody. So try not to get too confused. And when you're talking between action and event, it's kind of reversed. It can get very confusing. So that's why I'm repeating it. Right. Okay. So we've got the variable we set up. It's taking in that record from that parameter, because the execution, again, remember, it happens on the component side, notifying it. So when I do this and I click the button, the fork awakens, right? But now what we're passing back in a return type to the actual, what am I trying to say? To the actual component is this value right here, which is rise of the contributor. So when I come back into the component, that's the default data, right? And that's fine. When I come, or it's setting the schema, the expected schema. When I come back in here, now I can go ahead and I can add an image. And so I'll do that. Right. And inside the button where I'm executing that, I need to get that return type somehow, right? So I remember, I can't reference the parameter values outside of the actual component and stuff like that, right? And I can't reference the return type somewhere else. So if I were to come into the event here and say like default values, event props, dot, right? I don't have access to the event property, but I don't have access to my return types or anything here, right? So what I do is over here, and again, I've got a whole other video on event types and return data. So go watch that. If you want to know the nitty gritty details, set, and I'm going to say event var event return data. That's fine. And then I'm going to execute that, do that. All right. So now what's happening is we can see when I click on that variable, we can see it's a record because it knows that it's getting back a record as the return type. And so now what I can do is I can come into this image, which is part of the control or the component, and I can say var event return data dot badge URL, right? It's text. Of course, it'll exchange it for the image because it knows it's going to be an image when it finds it on the interwebs. And so now when I go back to the screen and I scroll out here, we got the Fork Awakens. And when I click on the button, Rise of the Contributor, right? Fork Awakens is showing up there because that's what's showing up there, right? In terms of the notify. But I could also come back into my button here. And I could also do the notify here, right? Notify, and I will say var event return data dot badge name. And I want to come back to my screen and I want to turn it off here just so that they're not fighting. Then be fighting words. Don't want them to fight. So when I click here, Rise of the Contributor, that's the notification that's happening inside the component as part of that return data, right? So a lot of moving pieces to all of this, but it just shows exactly how dynamic and liquid these things are, how you can really make them interactive and you can decide how to use them. Again, you don't have to use return data. You don't have to at all. It's perfectly fine if you don't want to, and that's fine. All right, one other thing is that let's say, for example, I am not going to define this, right? What if we just want to return default data back to the app, or back to the component, I should say. Here, I could say image event badge, because remember, I'm setting it up to be the record, image event badge, right? Now it's perfectly happy, because that's actually a record. That was one of the other benefits of me, instead of terminating here down to the actual item itself, including a record, I could just pass that information back in. Of course, you're probably going to want to modify it in real life or do something with it before you pass it back in, but maybe there's some weird use case, right? You can do that here. Again, just shows how malleable this is. So if I want to, I can come back over, or actually no, I can just execute because I'm passing in the default stuff. So if I come back to the screen here, we see that's Rise of the Contributor, but if I click this button now, we see the Fork Awakens for both. Because essentially, I'm just taking the default values, remember, because it's not a required parameter, the default values is being passed to my app. My app is then doing something with them, right? In this case, I'm showing it in an image here. And then I'm just essentially packaging it right back up and sending it back to the component, and the component is using it. It's actually using that default value the entire way, which is kind of cool, right? Because you're using those if you need to. So a lot of moving pieces. Absolutely do with it what you may. Really recommend that you take advantage of this, right? There's a lot of complexities that you can create in here. When I say complexities, I mean like really, really cool complexities. You can create some very feature-rich components. So appreciate you sticking this one out with me. It's a long one. Events has got a lot of moving pieces to it, and it kind of starts in a different way. So appreciate you sticking it out with me. If you have, please like and subscribe, and then throw down in the chat some ways in the comments how you plan on using this, or ask me a question, or let me know if you want to collaborate. Love working with you in the community. Appreciate all that you are doing. So let's work together on creating some cool stuff and share it with the world. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.